My name is Mara Ellison, I'm 28, and the night my future mother-in-law called me street garbage across a crystal table the size of a small plane and the room, full of linen and lacquer, of people who think their applause measures humanity, went quiet. Something in me shifted from hurt into a plan so cold and clean it felt like glass under my palm. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from and hit like and subscribe, because this is the story of how one phrase, delivered like an edict over shrimp and champagne, set off a chain that ended with me canceling her wedding venue the night before the ceremony, not out of petty spite but to enforce a simple rule. Dignity is non-negotiable, and no amount of family pedigree rewires responsibility for cruelty. I'm engaged to Daniel, kind, nervous, the kind of man who still says we when we argue about dishes. And for months his mother, Celeste Vaughn, had been a character unraveling on social media like glitter that leaves marks on everything it touches. Hostess calls that sounded like verdicts, an Instagram story where she mocked a server for carrying a tray, the kind of small humiliations that accumulate into a moral debt. We tried to navigate it quietly. I had dinner with her once in a high-ceilinged restaurant where the chandeliers looked like stars that charged you for their light. She told me, with the calm of someone settling the world, that certain kinds of people look better where they belong. And I let the room swallow my indignation, because at that time forgiveness felt like the route to a wedding and a family I wanted to belong to. Then the engagement dinner happened, an event Celeste styled like a coronation for her son. Menus in gold emboss, guests in the right shade of quiet status, and in the middle of it, leaning over my plate as if to deliver a seasoning, she said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear, "Sweetheart, you're lovely in a very streety way, street garbage, if I'm honest. My Daniel deserves better." The words landed like broken glass across a silk floor. People smiled the practiced smiles of adults who think safety lives in avoiding the weather of confrontation. Daniel's jaw went white and then red, and for a second I watched him count his options like a man flipping credits. He did nothing, which felt like permission, and his silence stung more than the words. I did not yell. I did not throw a glass. I left because the staircase felt more honest than the dinner table. And on the way down, I recorded the exchange on my phone, not to weaponize but to preserve truth, because sound is a thing that does not erode the way memory sometimes does. That recording would be important later, but at the time it was just a small bright thing in my pocket, the only incandescent evidence that a woman charged with the title mother had decided to strip another human of dignity in a crowded room. I told Daniel what had happened. He apologized, he said the right words. He texted his mother asking for clarification. She texted back platitudes and then later a note that pretended regret but had the flat tone of someone who has learned to say comfortable things and continue the habitual cruelty regardless. I considered confrontation, open argument in the dining room where her friends would watch, but something in me wanted the moral outrage to be of use, not performance. I wanted consequence structured like a lesson rather than spectacle, and I knew instinctively that a venue, the one place you contract to keep people safe and happy during the most public of private promises, would be where terms, not tears, could speak. The venue was the Orpheum Terrace, an 8-story glass-end marble jewel that sits above the river, a place where chandeliers behave like celebrities and a pastry is plated like an argument. Celeste had booked the Orpheum almost a year in advance, a deposit like a claim stone on the calendar, and a contract that most people treated as an afterthought in the nerve of wedding planning, signed, countersigned, and filed away. Many people think power sits in titles or in calls. I had learned that power often sits in language you can read and in clauses that can make strangers overrule and insult. The very next day I sat down with my friend and attorney Nora Kim, who reads contracts like some people read poetry. She finds rhythm in the places others see only punctuation. I showed her the recording, my hands trembling at the edges because the whole thing felt obscene. That humans talk like trash and the world pretends it's a weather condition. Nora listened and then asked me one question that set the rest of the night on its track. What does the venue contract say about conduct? Most contracts, she said, have a clause boring neutral, usually tucked under licensing and conduct. That allows a venue to deny access or revoke services if the client's behavior jeopardizes the safety, reputation, or the staff of the facility, or if the event creates a hostile environment or exposes the venue to liability. That line, dry as municipal code, had the power of a judge in a crisp suit. I couldn't sign it away with words. I had to present the staff and the venue with proof that the behavior of Celeste Vaughn and her entourage had created an unacceptable risk. The plot sharpened into something both practical and theatrical. We needed evidence beyond my recording to show that this wasn't an isolated comment, but part of a pattern. Emails where she demanded certain staff be moved, messages to caterers that suggested payment withheld as punishment, a rehearsal dinner incident where a server's trivial mistake became a performance of degradation, and the documentation that wedding planners seldom imagine will be used against them. Private notes, witness statements, vendor communications. I started to assemble a paper trail, not to escalate hate, but to make sure truth could sit beside law like two competent witnesses. I called the wedding planner, an exhausted genius named Lena who wore a headset and patience, and who, in a more honest world, would have been the hero of 1,000 smooth nights. Lena confided that Celeste had a temper with staff, that she demanded the head waiter be replaced after a tiny flourish of spilled butter at a rehearsal, and that vendors had been instructed to manage the crowd in ways that skirted legality. The kicker, one of the caterer's assistants, a young man named Marco, had quit earlier in the summer after Celeste publicly berated him for not lining up the chairs to her precise desire. Lena said she had notes but was terrified. Weddings are small worlds and everyone depends on everyone, but she promised to share what she could. I met Marco over cheap coffee in a corner that smelled like milk and anxiety. He was small, quick to apologize for breathing too loud. He told me the rehearsal night story and added a detail that unlocked everything. She said, in front of half the staff, "People like you should learn to disappear when the right people speak." And the cadence of the sentence made it clear this was not an accidental cruelty but an ideology practiced as routine. I recorded Marco's witness statement with Nora on a three-way call so it would have the shape of truth beyond memory. The documentation multiplied like footprints. Texts from vendors, a planner's note that Celeste requested specific seating to avoid certain attendees, language that used exclusion as if it were taste. And the rehearsal footage Lena had grainy backlit, but enough, where you could see Celeste's body lean in like a gavel and hear that phrase, street garbage, not as an error but as the final phrase of a pattern. The venue manager at the Orpheum, a man named Harris who had spent 20 years learning the art of discretion, was reluctant at first. Venues make money on weddings and do not like to be part of internecine family drama. But he had standards to maintain and staff to protect. I met him on a Tuesday in a small office that smelled of old contracts and new coffee, and I opened a tablet and handed him the evidence in a neat, clinical order. The recording of the dinner, Lena's rehearsal notes, Marco's statement, the caterer's email about threats to staff compensation, and a small line of texts where Celeste called a coordinator by name and demanded they manage certain friends like they were props for a tableau. Harris read and did not speak for a long time, which is always a sign that a person is compiling a standard and matching it to the facts. "We do have a clause," he said finally, the words slow like a summons. "Our contract says the client must agree to conduct themselves and their guests in a manner that does not disrupt venue operations or endanger staff or other guests, and that the venue reserves the right to terminate services if this obligation is breached." That's pretty broad. But it's honest. We don't want a trial. We want a party that doesn't ruin people. That night I did a thing people imagine only in movies. I arranged a meeting with Harris, Nora, Lena, Marco, and the head caterer, and we rehearsed the script of truth. We made it boring, timestamps, witness statements, concise notes. We created a document that clearly laid out the pattern of behavior and the way it created a risk to staff and to the venue's reputation. Liability is not moralizing, it's just math. Angry guests create incidents, incidents create claims, claims create closed doors. Nora prepared a letter that was not personal but procedural. It has come to the venue's attention pursuant to Provision 8.2 of our client agreement that the forthcoming event scheduled for date may result in a breach of contractual obligations related to guest conduct and staff treatment. In light of documented incidents occurring during the engagement week and the potential for staff harm and reputational risk, the venue reserves the right to suspend services effective immediately pending remedial assurances that mitigate said risk. It was a legal neutrino, small, but it carried mass. We were deliberate because we wanted the moral weight of fact to be undeniable. Vindictiveness has a way of crumbling if it smells like vengeance rather than consequence. The next part was the hardest, the human one. I emailed Daniel and told him the truth. what I'd recorded, what I had gathered, and what I planned to do. His silence on the phone more than once felt like salt, and his first words when he finally answered were thin. "Mara, you can't." "I can," I said. "I have to." He argued about family, about optics, about how canceling a venue the night before would make us the villains in 1,000 curated stories. "You're right," I said. "I will look like the villain. You'll look like the son with a dramatic fiancé, but I'd rather be a villain in people's feeds than let the staff be the invisible victims in their posts." He said nothing, which is how consent sometimes sounds when it's being chewed on. I told him if he couldn't stand with me, that would be his choice to carry. He said he would come to the meeting with Harris and listen. Then we moved to mechanics. Harris said the Orpheum's board would meet if the manager advised them. Lena said vendors would be furious but also relieved, and Marco was willing to testify that he'd left his job due to humiliation. It all felt fragile and, in a legal way, beautiful, like a scaffolding of responsibility waiting to hold a truth. We had to time it. The wedding was scheduled for Friday with a rehearsal dinner on Thursday. If we moved too early, Celeste would have a month to spin sad tweets and neutralize our evidence. If we moved too late, guests would be in town and chaos would look like a storm the venue had to weather. We chose the night before, the place where threat and consequence cross, and the drama would be public because protection is something that needs witnesses. On Thursday morning, Nora filed a heads-up letter to the Orpheum's board with our documentation and asked for a meeting that afternoon. I went to the hospital, did my rounds, and ate lunch at a bench outside the ER like a person who needed to breathe between decisions. I texted Daniel a small thing: "We're doing this for people who can't fight." He replied with a heart and with legs that trembled in the sort of way people do when they set themselves against the current. At 4:00 p.m., Harris called and asked me to meet at 6 with the venue board, and he said something I will never forget. "Bring the evidence. Speak calmly. We will call whatever we must." We rehearsed the presentation in Nora's living room like a small chapel of truth. Lena cried once in the kitchen, pressed her face into her palm because she'd loved designing a wedding for Celeste's family for months with the naive hope that women like Celeste could be gentle. She didn't think signing a contract would be used to stop harm. The board meeting was a portrait of discreet power, men and women whose hands had learned to fold profit into politeness. The table was long and the chairs forgiving. I spoke last not because I wanted attention, but because I believed truth is its own loudness. Nora laid out legal exposure, Lena gave internal vendor testimony, Marco recounted his walk away from unfair treatment through tears that had nothing performative about them, and Harris read the contract clause like a man reading a line in a weather report that had finally become a warning. The board nodded as if they had been waiting for someone to name the weather. It ended with a decision, as corporate bodies do things, quiet and final. They would invoke the clause, they said. They would call Celeste's coordinator and ask for remedial assurances. If the assurances were cosmetic or evasive, the venue would suspend services. If the staff reported fear or the vendors declined to work under coercion, the venue would write a termination letter. We left the meeting with a letter in Harris's hands and a cadence in our chests like someone who had walked a line without collapsing. That evening, as vendors set up final details and a florist ironed ribbons, I sat with Daniel on a bench near the Orpheum's river terrace, and we watched the city lights settle into place like small consensus. He held my hand and said quietly, "If they pull it, I will come with you." I felt like I had been handed oxygen. The night before the wedding, Celeste's planner called to ask for final checks, and I told Lena to be firm but kind. I told Marco to come if he wanted. Lena texted me a photograph of the rehearsal. Celeste in a white robe, hair pulled like a crown, speaking into the air with the proud air of a woman who had never had to account for the people her words might harm. At 3:00 a.m., she posted a story about family pressure with a candle emoji. Twitter is a net nobody wants to fall into when a family is performing for sympathy. At 7:00 a.m., vendors assembled final invoices. At 8:00, Harris sent Celeste a carefully worded message requesting immediate remedial assurances regarding staff treatment and a willingness to sign a conduct addendum. Celeste's reply arrived with the glib speed of someone who believes words are armor. "This is theater. I have never been anything but gracious. My guests deserve light." Her public posture and private cruelty are often two different dialects. At 9:00 a.m., looking into the faces of exhausted staff, Harris received a private recorded voicemail from Celeste's coordinator claiming that the mother had indeed made harsh comments about certain staff alignment and had demanded a seating list that excluded certain family members for reasons that sounded dangerously like discrimination. Harris listened and then, with a procedural calm that was almost prayer, drafted a formal notice of suspension of services pending editorial remedial action. He called Celeste and arranged a meeting that afternoon, one last chance to offer meaningful remediation. Celeste arrived at noon in a dress that had been insured against storms and with a publicist who smelled like denial. She opened with a practiced voice, "Mara, darling, what a mess. We're all trying to do something beautiful. Then help make it beautiful for everyone," I said. "That's what we asked." She blinked, as if the world had turned and shown her a new angle. The meeting lasted 90 minutes, which is long if you are used to people bowing quickly and short if you are used to people having to listen to the cost of their choices. Nora walked Celeste through the contract clause and the evidence, Lena spoke of the human cost, and Marco stood with a legal observer and described the night he left. Celeste's argument was the old script, "I was under stress." It was a phrase, "You're making a mountain out of a molehill." It wasn't a phrase, Marco said quietly. It was the last in a list. And for the first time in a room not curated by benefit and brunch, Celeste's words were measured against the ledger of consequence. Harris asked for commitments: an apology to staff, a binding conduct pledge, independent mediation to resolve disputes, a public corrective statement for the rehearsal remarks, added staff support paid by the client, and a mechanism for the venue to monitor compliance. Celeste agreed to some things in principle. She is good at performance, but she delayed on the real mechanics, seeking PR language over binding remedy. At 4:15 p.m., the board convened and Harris presented the options. Accept cosmetic assurances that might keep the booking but risk future incidents, or suspend the event and protect staff and the venue. The board voted. The vote wasn't theatrical, it was administrative and final. At 5:00 p.m., Harris delivered the decision in a letter that had the dry accuracy of weather warnings. Due to documented breaches of conduct and insufficient remedial assurances, the Orpheum Terrace is compelled to suspend services for the event scheduled for tomorrow, until such time as binding accommodations and assurances are provided that guarantee the safety and dignity of our staff and guests. Celeste's world, which had been an army of image operators and apology strategists, shuddered with a sound like someone closing a book on a line that had been reading itself as perpetual. She screamed, then cried, then edited. The planners called vendors, guests texted confusion, lingerie shipments held in limbo. The groom called Daniel, who called me and said he didn't understand. I can tell you the chaotic joy of being right is sharp and heavy. There were threats, lawsuits bandied in the parlors of people who think money is moral, and there were vows to rebook in bigger, louder venues. But the outcome I wanted was not the social media inferno, it was a change. Staff felt safer, vendors felt heard, and Celeste felt the hum that happens when a person must account for the harm their voice describes as a joke. The night before had been chosen for maximum pressure because it leaves little time for spin and forces real choices. Will you apologize in a way that changes behavior, or will you create a spectacle and call it wounded dignity? Celeste chose spectacle first. A tearful message posted to 1,000 followers claiming she had been canceled by virtue-signaling bridesmaids, which is always the last resort for anyone who prefers applause to accountability. Her narrative met with skepticism because the room had seen a set of facts and not just an edited reel. Daniel, crushed and furious at the idea that his mother's day might be ruined, initially railed at me for doing this and declared he would host a small, family-only ceremony elsewhere, which was the sort of limp concession people make when they want to keep a number of plates spinning. I told him quietly that a small ceremony without acknowledgement is not resolution. He and I fought, not loudly, but in that private way where two people decide whether their future will be a house of compacts or a home of shared standards. The morning after the suspension, Celeste hired lawyers who churned through threats and press releases like sharks smelling blood. We received their letters, demand letters, claims of defamation, demands for reinstatement, and Nora sent back precise, patient replies that pointed to the contract and to the documented facts. A lawsuit would have dragged this into months of theater. The venue had already made the practical statement. Staff would not be exposed if their employer could help it. The real shift came gradually. The caterer who had been threatened got a public letter from the venue commending their professionalism and noting the discontinuation of any business relationship with the client if similar behavior recurred. The planner received an insurance reimbursement for her lost nights because the venue took responsibility for the disruption and paid vendors who had canceled other events in solidarity. Marco got a call offering him his job back with an apology and a new wage and a path to a supervisory role that meant he would never again be dismissed with a line. These were not flashy restorations. They were corrections and modest recoveries that made the word work less precarious in that building. For Celeste, the social fallout was significant because she had based much of her identity on being the arbiter of social taste. Being denied a venue was, to her, as big as being denied an invitation. She responded with fury at first, then with performative sorrow, and finally with a quiet attempt to buy hearts back with gifts and charity telegrams, an old trick for those who prefer to purchase absolution rather than earn it. Daniel wrestled with it in the weeks after, sometimes siding with his mother in small ways, sometimes aligning with me when he saw the way our staff's faces had changed, open with a small light in them that said someone was listening. We went to therapy, we had hard conversations about loyalty versus justice. We decided slowly and with pain that marriage cannot be a theater where one partner performs to please a third party. In the aftermath, there was a modest public debate, op-eds and hot takes that reduce nuance to tags, but the real work was private and interminable. Negotiated apologies that included real commitments, forced mediation sessions where Celeste had to sit in a room with the server she'd mocked and speak apology into a microphone that recorded her tone, not just the words, and then, perhaps the strangest medicine of all, community service. Celeste funded a one-year hospitality training course at the community college after a municipality ministered to the venue staff with classes on rights and workplace safety. She called it reparative. I watched the first day the students went to class and realized that the loudest part of my revenge was not the cancellation. It was that the world now required Celeste to fund repair in the very area where she had harmed others. A paradox she met with reticence and slowly with awkward accountability. Did I feel vindictive? Sometimes, in the seconds when the news cycles debated me and my face circulated with cheap editorials, I felt the hot pulse of revenge like a fever. Mostly, I felt the cooler satisfaction that comes from having kept your hands out of blood while making sure someone else learned a different script. The night before the wedding had been chosen not to humiliate but to force choices. Change or perform. Celeste chose both, first performance, then payment of consequence. Daniel and I rebuilt in the rubble with honest conversation, counseling, and small rituals that told us who we wanted to be. We postponed the wedding by a year, and when we married it was small, large in ways that mattered, and staffed by people who had been treated with respect from the beginning, vendors we had worked with through the crisis, servers who had regained work, and a planner who no longer had to worry about being erased. Celeste came, eventually. The ceremony was awkward, then tentative. At one point she stood up in the middle of the reception and said, clumsily, "I owe an apology," and it was not perfect, but it was audible and public and therefore accountable. People said I had ruined her day, and others said I had saved a staff's year, and the truth is never as tidy as headlines. It is a ragged line of consequences stitched by apologies and worker protections and a small program that put cash into training for hospitality workers. If this story landed like a fist in your chest or a confirmation in your throat, if someone has ever told you you're less, you have options that do not require violence. Documentation, leverage, community, and the quiet courage to stand where the rules are being written. Tell me where you're watching from, like and subscribe for more stories where dignity wins over decorum, and share this with someone who needs to know that sometimes you cancel a venue not to watch a moment burn, but to light a different kind of future where everyone who works a night is seen in the morning.